So I'm delighted to welcome you today to the Center for International Studies and this talk by Daron Acemoglu, who is, as you know, the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at MIT. Before I turn it over to him, I will indeed remind you or inform you that we have a couple of other events, among others, that may interest you. But the two I want to mention on November 13th at 6:30 in the evening in Kirsch Auditorium will be The Attack of the Drones, Ethical, Legal, and Strategic Implications of UAV Use. And that's with Barry Posen, our own Barry Posen, Brian Hare, and Rabia Mahmood, with Ken Oy, Professor Oy, moderating. Should be very interesting. And on December 5th at the Media Lab, the new building, 6th floor, James Fallows will be here to speak about China. Two really good events, and I hope you can come. I read this book, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, over the summer, and I immediately asked Michelle Nooch, our Director of Public Programs, to schedule this talk. And I recommend this book to you very highly. I mean, this is one of the rare cases, I think, of, not so rare perhaps, but unusual cases of important cutting-edge social science research applied to today's complex problems, and in an extremely enlightening and entertaining, even I would say, form. This is a very well-written, very compelling book to read, with lots and lots and lots of ideas, and as I hope we'll get into in a little while, very relevant to just about everything that's on the table in the United States and elsewhere with respect to development and economics and politics and so on. So we're really delighted to have Daron here today. I won't go into a long introduction. He's been at MIT for many years. He got his PhD at the London School of Economics. He's had many awards and honors, including the Erwin Klein Nemers Prize, and several for his previous book with James Robinson, Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, published 6 years ago. He will speak for about 30 minutes. I will ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to you until 6 o'clock. So please help me welcome Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks to everybody for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here at my own institution to talk about why nations fail. So I want to give just a brief overview of the argument with some of the implications. In particular, I'll talk about just the broad ideas and then bring it to the US case, which is one of the several implications that we don't actually develop in sufficiently great detail in the book, but it's one that people are obviously interested, this being the country that many of us live in. So the starting question of the book is actually quite a common one in social science. What explains the enormous differences in living standards and prosperity around the world? This was the question, actually, that The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's treatise that set out the scene for the modern discipline of economics, asked more than 250 years ago. But notably, when Adam Smith was writing, the gaps between rich and poor nations were actually quite small relative to what they are today. To the best of our estimates, those were of the order of 4- or 5-fold between the poorest and the richest nations. Today, that is around in the neighborhood of 50-fold between the poorest and richest nations. So in our globalized, integrated, unified world, actually the puzzle of why there are such huge gaps in prosperity has become even deeper. And of course, with such an important question, theories abound. Some people will argue that geographic factors natural resources or disease environments or the climate or access to navigable rivers or seashores are really important and make some nations destined to succeed and others destined to fail. Others emphasize the importance of culture. Going back to Max Weber, Protestant work ethic has been emphasized. Others in the 20th century have laid a lot of emphasis on Judeo-Christian values. For instance, in the context of the Middle East, many argued that the Islamic religion was incompatible with democracy or made these regimes more likely to be dictatorial. Or in the context of Haiti, people have argued that the work ethic there makes it impossible for the nation to succeed and so on. And yet others, quite popularly actually among economists and other social scientists, would subscribe to a sort of a view of enlightened leadership. So according to this view, some nations succeed because they adopt the right policies, and they adopt the right policies because they have the right leaders. Those leaders understand what sort of policies or what sort of arrangements will work, or perhaps they have the right advisors who give them the right advice. And of course, that's why economists like it, because we often play the role of advisors. And of course, the economics discipline revolves around the issue of us identifying what are market failures and how we can develop clever solutions to them. Actually, the main argument of the book, put very simply, is that yes, policy mistakes or institutional mistakes from the viewpoint of bringing prosperity to a nation are really important, but they are not really mistakes. People get it wrong, but they get it wrong by design. And to expand on that, let me say a few more things, laying the seed. So our theory is actually quite simple. It's about incentives, economic incentives and political incentives, and those incentives are shaped by institutions, broadly the rules of the game in a society in the economic, social, and political sphere. In the economic sphere, we talk of inclusive economic institutions. Inclusive economic institutions are those that enforce property rights, that have judicial and contracting institutions that uphold contracts and enable individuals to enter into mutually beneficial agreements. And quite importantly, perhaps most importantly, they provide a level playing field, both in terms of regulations that don't prevent people from entering into businesses and occupations that are best for themselves, and providing the right sort of investments in public infrastructure and education and so on that make it possible for the population at large to participate in the economic game. And it's no surprise that I think inclusive economic institutions with these level playing field are really important, because if you look at sustained economic growth, growth in the long run that lasts not for just a couple of years, nor not just for a decade, but for extended periods of time, it's based on technological change, it's based on innovation, it's based on creative destruction. So any society that only uses the energy and creativity of a small fraction of its population is not going to be significantly prosperous in the long run. But the catch is that most societies throughout history, or even today, aren't ruled by inclusive economic institutions. They're ruled by extractive economic institutions that do the opposite. They don't create secure property rights, at least not for the majority of the population. They don't create a legal environment that upholds contracts, or they create an environment that's very biased. And most of all, they create a very tilted playing field where the politically powerful are protected by entry barriers, and the politically powerful have all the resources and get all the education, get all the rights to enter into the lucrative occupations and businesses. And of course, the word extractive here is not chosen by not chosen randomly. The idea that we want to communicate is that these institutions aren't there by mistake. They have been designed for a purpose, precisely to reallocate resources, redistribute resources from the majority of the population for the benefit of the politically few, whom we sometimes refer or often refer to in the book as the elite. And the reason why these extractive economic institutions don't support economic growth, sustained economic growth, is that because they don't generate the sort of innovation, they block technological change, and they don't create a secure property rights and the contracting environment for the majority of the population to take advantage of their talents and skills. In fact, quite the opposite. Throughout history, they create such a tilted playing field that much of the population is actually coerced for the benefit of the minority. Slavery, feudal labor relations, servile labor relations would be examples, but coercion is actually all around us if you look at history. And these extractive economic institutions don't exist in a vacuum. they are supported by a specific set of political institutions, which, to emphasize the sort of the symbiotic relationship between the two, we call extractive political institutions. Extractive political institutions are those that concentrate political power in the hands of a narrow elite and don't create political equality. They don't create checks and balances or constraints on the exercise of power. And you see why these two are going to create feedbacks between the two. Let's consider a specific example. Barbados, for example, in the 17th century, which was one of the richest places in the world at the time based on a sugar economy. But that sugar economy was organized around slavery, a very clear coercive institution, a sort of archetypal extractive economic institution. But of course, if you had political equality on the island, if everybody had a say about what sort of economic institutions, what sort of distribution of resources was going to prevail, people who were the slaves working at subsistence levels and all of their output being extracted from them would not have voted for slavery. Instead, of course, you didn't have political equality. You had an extreme form of political inequality. Look at judges on the island. Well, the judgeships were dominated by the very top 1% who were the major landholders in society. Look at the military power. Well, the major commandants were the same families that owned all the big plantations. What about political power? Well, the people who ran the island were, again, the same families. And that makes sense, of course, because if it weren't the same families, they would have incentives for changing the economic institutions and together with it, the distribution of resources in society. What we do in the book is try to explain why is it that extractive and inclusive economic institutions have very different implications for innovation, technological change, and economic prosperity, how they interact with extractive and inclusive political institutions, including political institutions being those that create more political equality, create the sort of constraints that I've mentioned being lacking under extractive political institutions. And also, quite a lot of it is about why is it that institutions persist and under what circumstances they change, and what we can say about this process of change and the hope for change under certain circumstances. But instead of going through those details, what I want to do is I want to go through one specific historical case to illustrate what we really mean by inclusive and extractive institutions, and why they emerge in some places and not in others, and why I have made the claims that the alternative theories emphasizing geography, culture, and enlightened leadership aren't the right places to look at for understanding the bulk of these big differences across nations. And there's no better lab for thinking about institutions and incentives than the New World, the Americas, because the institutions in this continent have been shaped by European colonization starting at the end of the 15th century. So let's start in South America. Of course, the Americas is also a microcosm for the huge differences that I have mentioned. Perhaps we don't see except for Haiti, we don't see the very, very poorest countries on this continent. But if you look at the South America versus North America, you see many cases of tenfold differences in income per capita. So why is it that the South is so much poorer? So let's start with the colonization of the southern cone of the continent. So with the conquistadors, who's not as famous as Pizarro and Cortez, for reasons you'll see, but no less significant nonetheless. And that's Juan Diaz de Solis, who in 1516 started the colonization of what is today Argentina and Uruguay. But de Solis did not encounter the Incas or the Aztecs. Instead, he came across bands of very sparsely settled, very mobile Indians called the Querandi and the Charruas. And de Solis actually had exactly the same sort of approach to colonization as the Pizarro and Cortez. And he was after capturing the Indians, putting them to work, and hopefully getting them to produce valuable agricultural products, and most importantly, extract gold and silver. So in fact, if you look at the 3 ships that de Solis took with him, it was filled with 2 sorts of people: soldiers, because he needed the manpower to coerce people, and goldsmiths, because he was interested in getting gold. However, unfortunately, there was no gold, and even more unfortunately for him, The Indians were very difficult to capture, being sparsely settled. And when they were captured, they were unused to hierarchical agricultural work, so they refused to work and they fought back. And in fact, some of them clubbed them to death. So it was pretty unfortunate for de Solis, and that's why he's not as famous as Pizarro and Cortez. But the other Spaniards sort of persevered. They were close to throwing the towel several times. Many of them starved because they were totally unprepared for growing food for themselves, despite the fact that actually around the areas around Buenos Aires, the Pampas and so on, are actually quite famous for their agricultural productivity today. But the Spaniards weren't planning to grow food themselves, and they weren't prepared for it. So just as they were coming close to throwing the towel, another one of the conquistadors, the Ayolas, Juan de Ayolas, sailed up the Parana River from that area to what is today Paraguay, Asuncion. And there he encountered another band of Indians, the Guarani. Well, the Guarani weren't the Incas or the Aztecs either, but they were somewhat more densely settled, and more important, they had already developed a sedentary hierarchical structure with their own princes and elite. So the Spaniards immediately took over this society. They declared themselves as the elite. They married some of the princesses. They took and adopted the existing labor institutions, in particular coercive institutions, and they set up a very successful, from the viewpoint of the Spaniards, colony that became a model for the later colonies. So in that context, they developed the sort of institutions that would be perfected later on, such as the encomienda, which was a land grab together with the labor on it, so it's a very coercive institution, or other labor institutions such as the mita and the repartimiento, which were again based on coercion. And the coercion is very notable here. I keep repeating it because it sort of emphasizes that these economic institutions were supported by a particular type of political power militarily at least, being very much in the hands of the conquistadors. And these economic institutions, even though they changed and adapted over time, actually lasted quite a long time in much of Latin America, and they proved later on to be not the sort of institutions that would encourage industrialization or economic growth in the 19th century, when many other parts of the world started growing rapidly. What about the North? Now, at this point, you might say, oh, of course, the South is poor, the North is rich, because that might be because of geography, or perhaps it's because of culture. After all, the North was colonized by the English, perhaps with their Protestant values, or perhaps the English were fleeing for their religious freedom, so they set up a very open society. Well, actually, the truth is a little more complex than that. So for that, let's turn to one of the very earliest colonization attempts in the North, which is the Jamestown colony, led by the Virginia Company, a profit-maximizing corporation which started in 1607. Now, Virginia Company is very interesting because it was a profit-maximizing corporation set up in London, and very much inspired by the Spanish model. They saw the Spanish king and the Spanish conquistadors made all this money, and they wanted in as well. So the shares of the Virginia Company were being sold because people wanted to invest in this very lucrative business. And what was the lucrative business? Well, again, it was to go to the Americas, find a bunch of people to coerce, to put to work, and perhaps get silver and gold. And for this reason, the Virginia Company sent in 3 ships, just like the Solis, and the 3 ships were filled with, you guessed it, soldiers and goldsmiths. But unfortunately, they also had a rude awakening. When they arrived there, just exactly like the Solis, they encountered very sparsely settled, very mobile, very non-cooperative hunter-gatherers, and repeating the same events, they couldn't survive, they couldn't grow their own foods, they started starving, they went through this famous starving time, only being sort of kept alive by, well, according to myth, spread by John Smith himself, by John Smith's ingenuity. But so be it. After a while, the Virginia Company realized that this is not going to be a good model. So they started looking for an alternative. But unfortunately for them, they didn't have the option of sailing up the Parana River and finding another more densely settled sedentary population that they could dominate. So that option wasn't open to them. So they came up with another possibility. They said, well, if we cannot capture and put to work the local population, we can bring our own lower strata as indentured servants, and we, the elite of the Virginia Company, the governors and the officers, would live off them, and then the Virginia Company's shareholders themselves would make money. So they brought a bunch of indentured servants, also called settlers. They weren't quite settling at this point voluntarily, but that turned out to be not so successful either. But before I tell you about why that wasn't successful, let me read from the laws that Sir Thomas Gates, the governor, and Sir Thomas Dale, the deputy governor, passed at this time. So the laws read like this. No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anybody who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals ears of corn shall be punished with death. No member of the colony who will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his private use upon pain of death. Now, you realize two things from this. First of all, this was no happy, shiny colony where people loved each other and lived consensually. But secondly, there was actually something quite real that the Virginia Company was afraid of. People running away, because these settlers were the resource that they were going to use to enrich themselves. And if these settlers, either if they traded on their own behalf, or if they ran away to the Indians, which they did quite often because the living conditions were awful, that they wouldn't be able to exploit those resources. So the extractive strategy wouldn't work. And at the end, they threatened death. They executed people, but it didn't work. So after a short while, the Virginia Company threw in the towel on this one as well. So their second strategy was a failure too. So what did the Virginia Company do? So at this point, they came up with a third strategy, a totally different one. They said, okay, fine, coercing the Indians or coercing the settlers doesn't work, so we'll try something else. We'll try to give incentives to the settlers. So they came up with the headright system, which essentially meant to give each settler a plot of land and secure property rights and tell them you can grow whatever crop you want here, and you should, this is your own land, you should do the right investments, and you can sell it to whoever you want, and this is going to be the system from now on. Now, it's all well and good, but there's only one catch. It was just 1 year ago that Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale were threatening anybody who traded an ear of corn with death. Now they're telling you, okay, now we're going to enforce your property rights and you're totally secure. So you wouldn't be accused of being totally paranoid if you didn't trust them fully. So in 1618, the headright system came, but it was followed by even a more important innovation in 1 year later in 1619, where the Virginia Company said, okay, fine, we're now going to transfer political power to you. So they introduced General Assembly, where all men would now decide the political direction of the colony. And in the same way that the institutions that emerged with the Guarani and with the Aztecs and the Incas persisted and were the basis of the economic institutions of Latin America, those that started in Jamestown Colony and were repeated actually with a sequence of events that were very similar in the Carolinas and in Maryland, persisted and were the basis of the 19th and 20th century American institutions. Now, at this point, it's also useful to go back and think about, well, how can we explain or how can we account for this divergence between South and North America? Let's go back to the sort of the alternative theories. First, about geography. Well, was there anything geographically different between the South and the North? I'm sure there were many differences, but it doesn't seem like those differences were really that important in explaining this divergence. It wasn't as if the areas occupied by the Aztecs or the Incas were agriculturally so different and unproductive that they were destined to fail while the North was destined to success. In fact, the opposite. At the time that the English and the Spaniards arrived, the richer, more civilized, more complex societies supporting denser populations were in what is today Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, and so on. So on the basis of just pure agricultural productivity, if that's what you thought was the main determinant of economic success, you would expect those places to continue to be successful. But of course, what we have seen is that those places have failed economically, and they failed precisely because they had very large populations, and those very large populations enabled the Europeans to set up the sort of colonies that they intended to. What about culture? Well, culture doesn't go very far either. Sure, of course, the people in the north were Protestants, and those in the south were Catholic. Some spoke Spanish, some spoke English. But actually, their culture was quite secondary. The strategy of colonization, their way of going about it, their objectives, all of these were very parallel. The Virginia Company may have been led by Protestants, but what they were trying to do were very similar. And the same thing applies to enlightened leadership. It's not as if the leaders of Virginia Company were so enlightened that they saw that one set of economic institutions was going to bring economic prosperity in 200 years. In fact, the opposite. The leaders of Virginia Company, especially Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale, failed. They weren't quite enlightened. They were unsuccessful in getting the sort of institutions that they wanted. It was the conquistadors like Pizarro and Cortez and de Ayolas who succeeded. So instead, the difference lies in the set of institutions that emerge. Those institutions emerge because there was a particular type of conflict between the elite, the conquistadors or the Virginia Company's elites, and the population on the ground. In one case, that conflict led to the establishment of extractive institutions that persisted. In the other case, that conflict resulted in the emergence of more inclusive institutions that became stronger over time. So crucially, we have to understand institutions, but also we really have to think of the politics of institutions. It is deeply political because in both cases, there were different models, but these different models benefited different sets of players. The economic and political institutions that the conquistadors were successful in imposing weren't the only possibility, but they were the possibility that they themselves would benefit from, and they were successful, militarily successful, and the conditions were conducive to their success. And they were able to actually install and develop these extractive institutions. In the North, those institutions failed, and out of their ashes came the inclusive institutions. So we have to think about this process of economic and political conflict, how it resolves, and how it leads to the emergence of one set of institutions versus another. We also have to think about how is it that once a particular set of institutions are in place, they persist. So I'm not going to have the time to talk about that now, but of course the encomienda or the mita have long disappeared. But we really have a path-dependent process of institutional development. Once you have a particular set of institutions, they are not forever, and they are not destiny, but they do have a powerful impact on the path of development of institutions over time. And that's why we cannot understand why when entirely new set of people, not the sons of conquistadors, came to power, for example, in the 19th century in Mexico, they were much more willing and able to set up other extractive institutions or favor their own friends instead of creating an inclusive environment that was open to economic activity by the broad majority of the population. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit more about the United States and bring the story of the United States to the present, and in the process emphasize both how inclusive institutions work and also the threats to inclusive institutions. In other words, instead of talking about what we spend quite a bit of time in the book, which is the process via which you transform extractive institutions into inclusive ones, I want to talk a little bit about the dangers of inclusive institutions turning into extractive ones. So let's first of all talk about the United States. How did the United States become rich? Well, if you think about it, the United States became rich in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, the estimates differ, but the United States wasn't, so much more prosperous than many parts of South America, for example, Mexico. But in the 19th century, the United States became rapidly industrialized. It became industrialized through a process of innovation and technological change and investment. And how was this investment driven? Who were the key entrepreneurs? That's where the remarkable thing is. First of all, the United States, just like Britain and a few other economies, had a much more secure set of property rights. The patent system, for example, which encouraged innovations in the United States, was just the tip of that iceberg, but was very important because of its symbolic value. It enabled people from all walks of life to be able to say, okay, this is my invention, and I will be able to market it, or I will be able to open a business on the basis of it and scale it up. And the patents are also useful because they give us a trail of who the big innovators of the 19th century were. And when you look at it, the majority of these innovators weren't sons of established families, or they didn't even come from rich families. They weren't even sons of, daughters were rare at the time for other reasons. They weren't even from families that were industrialists themselves. They were literally new men. And what enabled these new men, Thomas Edison, but many others, to be so successful was A, the patent system, but B, also their belief that once they came up with an invention, they would be able to produce, scale up using the labor market, enter into contracts with other businesses, and also expand their businesses in whatever direction was profitable. And that process worked reasonably well in the United States and led to rapid growth in many industries, and the United States became the technological leader. But by this, I don't mean to imply that the United States was a perfect society. Far from it. Throughout this period, the United States was ruled by partly inclusive, partly extractive institutions. While the early stages of that industrialization were underway, half of the United States was under slavery, the South. Another example of extremely extractive institutions. Even after slavery was formally abolished, it was replaced by Jim Crow and other gamut of institutions in the South that prevented people from choosing their occupations, and especially African Americans from being able to enter into occupations or obtain education or even politically participate in the political process. But what was important is that in each case, US institutions were flexible enough and open enough, and that again due to their broadly inclusive nature, to rise to the challenges, albeit slowly. So the Jim Crow institutions lasted for several decades, but they didn't last forever, and they crumbled during the civil rights era. There were other threats to the inclusivity of US institutions. For example, during and after, in the aftermath of the Gilded Age, when income inequality became huge in the United States, and political inequality started emerging along the same lines of income inequality. But that led to a political movement, first the populists and then the progressives, that campaigned exactly on creating a more level playing field and was successful in doing so both on the political and the economic side. But I think that also highlights some of the issues that are at the root of the long-run failure of extractive institutions. What was quite important for the United States in the 19th century is that even when there were periods in which economic inequality and political inequality increased, political power wasn't so monopolized in the hands of a narrow group that they could call all the shots and block innovation, block technological change, block new investments that threatened them. Contrast that to other countries, for example. Let me give you two examples from the 19th century again, but this time from Eastern Europe, Austria-Hungary and Russia. Well, while the United States was industrializing, building railways, building factories, coming up with new innovations, while the same thing was going on in the United Kingdom and in France, and later on in Germany, nothing of the sort happened in Austria-Hungary or Russia. Why not? Well, in Russia, let me start with Austria-Hungary. In Austria-Hungary, for example, Francis I was in power as an absolute emperor, and he was very strongly opposed to industry. He was very strongly opposed to railways because he saw industry and railways as destabilizing forces. If you allowed factories to be built, this would create a new class of wealthy men who would then start making political demands. He didn't want that. More troubling, Francis I, like many monarchs during that era, was very scared by the specter of 1848. So the last thing he wanted was workers congregating in factories and in cities, which he thought would be very destabilizing for the society. And so he did not allow factories being built. Railways, for the same reason, he was very much against railways. Railways would encourage people to mingle, to travel, to trade, and that, again, he thought would destabilize it. All of these were clearly things that would contribute to Austria-Hungarian economy, but Francis I, with the elites around him, blocked it. The same thing happened in Russia. Nikolai I had exactly the same view of factory and railways as Francis I, and he also blocked it. In Russia, however, after the Crimean War, when Russia was defeated by the French, British, and the Ottoman Empire, there was an about face. They said, well, for our international power, we have to have railways, and we have to have armaments, and we have to have factories. So under Alexander II, a rapid process of industrialization and railway building came. And that led to the stability that Nikolai I and Francis I were afraid, first to the 1905 and the 1917. So these men weren't irrational, but they were making a calculation based on their wish to keep the existing regime in power. So what enabled the United States to become such a powerhouse in industry, technology, innovation, was that they did not have the political power concentrated in the hands of Francis I or Nikolai I or anybody like that who could monopolize it. But therein, I think, lies the dangers that US institutions today face. At some level, we are in the middle of a perfect institutional storm. And we are in the face of a perfect institutional storm because we know that inclusive institutions can turn into extractive ones when political power becomes concentrated in the hands of a very small minority, just like Nikolai I or Francis I. And perhaps a cautionary tale here is Venice. Venice, probably based on some of the most inclusive institutions at the time, became one of the richest places in the world in the 10th century. This was indeed based on inclusive political institutions because Venice had a system of political participation that enabled essentially all merchant families to be represented in the Ducal Council and the Great Council. And in fact, if you look at the records, you see that over 80% of the people who were represented were entirely new men, again, not the sons of established families. And that created a much more inclusive political environment. And on the basis of this, it also had much more inclusive economic institutions than other places around the time. It created secure property rights and profit incentives for the merchants, but also, quite importantly, it created very innovative contracts. One of them was called the commenda, which enabled risk-taking to take place in a very open manner. For instance, it enabled people without capital, these new men, to enter into a profit-sharing arrangement with people with capital so that they could enter into the lucrative business line, so they wouldn't be monopolized by just in the hands of a few families who controlled the resources in Venice. But at the end of the 13th century, things started to change, especially a group of established families said, why do we have to share political power with all of these newcomers? And why do we have to share economic opportunities with these newcomers? If we could only monopolize these economic opportunities, we can make even more money, we can become even more powerful, we can have even greater status. So they engineered a political revolution or a counter-revolution in which they started monopolizing power. And in particular, they closed the Ducal Council and the Great Council to new families. From now on, in particular after 1315, there was a list, the Golden Book, of families who could be represented in these bodies, and anybody who wasn't in these lists couldn't become part of the ruling families. So from then on, the 80% of new men were out. But perhaps ominously, for what we are going through now, the political inequality quickly translated into economic inequality. So soon the same families started monopolizing trade, and they even banned the commenda, which was so important for the riches of Venice, but it made a lot of sense from their own perspective, not the society's perspective, from their own perspective to ban the commenda, because commenda was one of the channels through which new people without the capital could come and compete with them in their businesses. So what is the reason why I'm saying the US is in the middle of a perfect institutional storm? Well, because I think there are many changes, many of them having their origins in disparate places, that are created economic and political inequality in the United States. I think the first one is technological change and globalization that have been at the root of a very large increase in inequality in the United States. If you look at US income distribution or wage distribution from the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s, what you see is this kind of classic picture of a rising tide lifting all boats. Everybody in the distribution is experiencing their wages increase in tandem. And then from late 1970s to today, you see a huge fanning out of the wage distribution. The bottom is falling out, sometimes recovering, but sometimes going even worse. The middle is more or less stationary, and the top keeps on increasing. Things are even worse at the very top. If you look at the very, very wealthy, say, for example, the top 1%, or you can go even further and you can look at top 0.1%, but let me focus on the top 1%. Their share hovered around 10% in the 60s and the 70s. If you look at the 19th century, we don't have great data, but in all likelihood, it was even less than 10% before the Gilded Age, when the robber barons and a handful of very powerful families became very, very wealthy. After the 1970s, that share of the top 1% in national income keeps on increasing, and today it's way past 20%, coming close to 25%. So there's a huge inequality at the very top with a small group of families becoming very, very wealthy, and there is a much greater inequality opening up in the rest of the distribution. Now, a lot of that has its origin, as I said, in technological change and globalization, but some of it is also institutional. Many of the institutional arrangements in the United States, such as unions and minimum wages, that perhaps created some economic inefficiencies, but also limited the extent of inequality, including social norms of fairness and other things, have disappeared. And as a result, you see this inequality opening up in many different parts of the society. Well, you can say, what's wrong with inequality? Doesn't inequality provide incentives for entrepreneurship? Yeah, there is some of that. But there is another danger to inequality, which is that when economic inequality increases, that naturally translates into political inequality. The sort of the cycle in Venice was political inequality to economic inequality to political inequality, and that's what opened the way to the big reversal in institutions. So there is a real danger that the United States is becoming more politically unequal. And that sort of economic inequality creates another danger as well. When you have economic inequality, it also opens the way to the bad sort of populism, the sort of that Chavez, for example, exercises or exhibits in Venezuela, where on the basis of the discontent created by this sort of unfair inequality, you get political support for dismantling secure property rights or the market institutions that are important for economic growth and innovation. But that's not the only thing that's going on in the United States that's cause for concern. I think another one is our educational institutions. Part of the reason why inequality is increasing so much is because educational institutions in the United States haven't been as successful as they were. The United States became rich in the 19th century not only on the basis of patents, but also on the basis of being the country that was ahead of everybody else in terms of investing in human capital. But if you look at the data, it's much less optimistic at the moment. Sure, we still have institutions like MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Caltech, which are great places for engineering and innovation. But overall, if you look at, for example, male college completion rates, they've been declining or stationary for the last 4 decades. So we are still below where we were at the end of the 1960s. If you look at high school completion rates, we are barely above where we were in the 1960s. And of course, on top of it, the quality of high schools may be failing, and the quality of colleges may be failing, as shown by international test scores. Third, money and politics. Now, if there was greater economic inequality, that would be one thing to sort of say, well, economic inequality is unfair or is problematic, but we have been able to firewall it and it doesn't affect politics. But I think most people think, and fairly so, that money has been playing much more of a role in politics. Well, this might also have some exogenous sources. Perhaps the modern political campaigns are much more money intensive than they were. But whatever the cause is, I think there is a lot of evidence suggesting that money matters much more in politics, and as money matters much more in politics, politicians listen much more to the very wealthy and are influenced much more to the very wealthy. Our patent system, the patent system that was so important, for example, in underpinning the technological change in the 19th century, has, if anything, become an impediment to economic growth. So patents are now a barrier to entry against many companies, as experienced by, as illustrated by the fact that companies are being bought and sold not for their ideas, not for their productive capacity, but for their patent treasures. And finally, I think, although this is far from the expertise of an economist like myself to talk about, I think the war on terror and the general environment that has created is also important. Because if you look at the Gilded Age, which is perhaps a model for what we're going through right now, greater economic inequality, a number of families becoming fabulously wealthy, at the end it didn't have a fundamental, durable effect on U.S. inclusive political institutions. Why? Because these institutions were sufficiently open to create dissent, journalists and people organizing, forming movements and criticizing the robber barons and the politicians who were in their pockets. Well, with the war on terror, perhaps we are less able to do so. And it is actually quite important that, if we go back to Venice as a model, Venice actually did not have a professional police force during its inclusive days. It only introduced a professional police force at the end of the 13th century after the process of closure started, and that political police force became increasingly repressive. Why? Well, when political power was more equally distributed, you didn't need the political police force to silence people. But when the political power was concentrated in the hands of a few people, then the police force became much more important as a way of maintaining that status quo. With all of these things, I think, which create what I said, the perfect institutional storm, I think I am still, mildly optimistic about the United States, and I think that's something we can talk about more. But I think I'm mildly optimistic because at the end, even though inequality has increased, even though there is money in politics, U.S. political system is not dominated by just one interest. It's not dominated by finance, it's not dominated by software, it's not dominated by steel, it's not dominated just by the politicians. So there is enough openness, and even with the war on terror and the new sort of intolerance to dissent, a lot of people are still vocal and talking about it, and perhaps the internet makes it much easier for us to talk about these things. But I think even if you are optimistic, I think the sort of perspective that we try to develop suggests that we should never take inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions for granted. They are very important for the long-run prosperity of a nation, but they're also our collective choices, and if we let them go to pieces, they will go to pieces. So I'll just stop there and take John's questions.
Do you want to sit down?
Yeah, I will sit down. Thank you.
Well, you can see that was like a little teaser for the whole book. I think it was the whole book. But there's a lot more.
I had 5 more minutes.
Well, you answered one of my questions, which was about the United States. I'm sure others will have further questions about that. So I'm actually going to just ask one question. Excuse me. And that's about global economics. I know you're mainly talking about nations. But I'm interested also, because globalization is so important to our way of understanding these things now, I want to ask about the effect of structural adjustment policies, privatization, marketization, especially in the developing world, where I think many critics would say these policies could be viewed, in effect, as extractive. That is, that they're the conditions that have been imposed from time to time by the IMF and other international financial institutions can be viewed as undermining the vitality of political institutions in developing countries that are needed for growth, particularly. So how does your analysis square with that criticism?
I think you're raising several interesting issues. So let me first touch upon something that emphasis on the global economy suggests, which is sort of partly missing from the book. We talk about it, but it doesn't sort of receive enough of the emphasis, that the sort of emphasis that it deserves, which is that at the end of the day, our analysis is very much focused on nations, and that's why we talk about nations. But in an increasingly connected and globalized world, and of course this was true even in the 16th century, external conditions matter a lot. So we only touch on this in the book, for example, in the context of colonialism, how colonialism not only changed what went on in Europe, but it changed what went on in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. But I think that's an area which requires much more of a sort of a systematic framework, and part of that systematic framework would be, how do you think about international organizations in that context? How do you think about the IMF? How do you think about the United States' impact in other countries and so on? So we don't quite have that in the book. But be that as it may, I think I can still say a few things about structural adjustment and privatization. So I think my view is a little different, but it might arrive to the same sort of conclusions. That actually, on paper, many of the ideas that were pushed by the IMF weren't, or the World Bank or other international organizations you pick, weren't actually misguided. So sure, if you look at any society where the government is a big part of the economy, that creates both political and economic distortions. First, it creates economic distortions because governments are not good at running businesses. And second, it creates huge political distortions because patronage politics is much encouraged. But you really also have to think of the context in which privatization is being done and in what way it's being done. And take, again, some examples. In Mexico, for example, you had the privatization of Telmex. How was it done? Well, it was done through a very opaque auction, which at the end allocated it at a very, very lucrative, in a very, very low price, shares for loans sort of scheme to Carlos Slim, and lo and behold, on the basis of this, he became the richest man in the world. So that sort of privatization, of course, is very troublesome. First, it allocates assets in a monopolistic way, so monopoly is bad. It allocates assets not to the people who have the best value for them, but it allocates them to the politically powerful, and it allocates them in a way that makes future economic growth quite problematic. Take another example, Russia. So in Russia, again, I think there is little doubt in economic theory, and I think economic theory is very correct here, that it was imperative to privatize assets ultimately. But the question is, how do you do that? The way that this was done was through insider privatization, again through a loan for share scheme. In a political context where political power was very much in the hands of a set of shady people, and it created the oligarchs and it paved the way for the return of the KGB. So I think the way that I would sort of say it is that when economic advice is being given, either for without understanding the political economy or for other purposes than economic enrichment of the country, then it risks creating much deeper political inefficiencies that overwhelm the economic gains that these might create. So I think in many cases, but not in all cases, structural adjustment policies fall into that category. But then there are many examples in which when structural adjustment has been able to be done in the right way, it has created efficiencies. Turkey, for example, where finally some sort of structural adjustment was actually implemented in 2001, 2002, was very important. It reduced the effect of the government in the economy. It brought inflation down. It brought much better control mechanism for government spending. Not all of them are still alive today, but it sort of underpinned relatively healthy growth in the Turkish economy for a period of 7, 8 years. So I think what we have to distinguish, but again, this is my view, is that good economics doesn't always translate into the right policy advice unless you take the political context into account.
Okay, let's open it up. We have about 45 minutes. We need you to speak into a microphone. Is that right? Because this is going to be on MIT Television, World, whatever it's now called. Oh, okay.
Should I locational advantage?
I think
why don't you get up there?
Yeah, I think it's better because otherwise I won't see the person who's asking the question. This way I can.
Is it on? Look, hello. Okay.
Hi.
Locational advantages. First, I'd like to say I thoroughly enjoyed the book and find the notions of exclusive, inclusive, and extractive institutions useful as heuristics. But I'm a little worried that it's hard to unpackage them except ex post. And the robber baron case is one example. If you ask somebody, and I think there's still debates over this now, what the role of that period was in American economic history, you might have some people defending primitive accumulation. You could probably have similar arguments for the 90s. But I want to push it a little harder around the problem of taxation. Taxation can clearly be extracted. It can also be used for inclusive purposes. You can have extractive taxation used for inclusive purposes. And the example I'd like you to comment on is the paradox of the European welfare state being financed by a regressive tax, which one might think is extractive, the VAT tax, and America not having this and using progressive taxation in a way that doesn't allow it to produce the beneficial redistribution that we want to see in the education system and so on.
You're referring to the VAT.
Right.
So I think you're making some excellent points, which I don't disagree with. But I think it's, guilty as charged. I think some things might be quite difficult on the spot to see, exactly how they function. But I think that's in the nature of the beast. And it's in the nature of the beast for the following reason. Let me give you an example to illustrate that, which is, you can define extractive institutions on just one dimension. So you can say, if you have slavery, that's bad. If you don't have slavery, that's good. But really, slavery, nobody is interested in slavery as an institution in itself. They are interested in slavery as an instrument for other things. So slavery is useful as a very encompassing social institution that enables a group of people to dominate society politically and economically and coerce labor at very low wages to work in a certain set of occupations. And what happens, is very well illustrated in the US South. You suddenly come from the outside and you ban slavery, but then other things pop up which play more or less the same role as slavery. So if you just focused on slavery, you would say, oh, well, slavery itself is, has disappeared. But instead, other institutions that are quite different, some of them are in the form of vagrancy laws, some of them are, Southern paternalism, which sort of make up together a de facto institution that works in the same way as slavery. Having said that, I think there are some common elements that we can see even as we go along, so we don't have to wait all that much ex post. So any set of institution, I think, that is based on coercion, and I think that is fairly clear. Perhaps one can disagree about the specific cases, but it's fairly clear. It's based on coercion, either in the labor market or in product markets, is extractive. It forces people to enter into economic interactions that they wouldn't have done had they had the choice. So therefore, you have to sort of make do, I think, given these situations. But coming back to the second sort of issues that you have raised, I think taxation is the way that I like to think about this, but you're right, this is not actually sort of explained in any detail in Why Nations Fail. You cannot separate taxation from what the tax revenues are being used for. So let's look at, for example, just two cases. Zimbabwe and Zaire under Mobutu and Sweden. Which one is more extractive? I think everybody, with any reason, would argue that Zaire is much more extractive. But Zaire has a government tax revenue of around 5%. Sweden, upwards of 45%. But, what's important is that government tax revenue, together with a lot of other government rents in Zaire, are being used to enrich Mobutu and the clique around him. Whereas in Sweden, they are being used broadly for what we would view as part of building an inclusive society, providing education and daycare and other social services to everybody, regardless of their income, providing unemployment and other sort of social insurance so that there aren't great inequalities in society. Now, to what extent is that made possible by VAT? I'm not going to be able to say anything of very definite on that, but of course there are limits. So if you had the same sort of redistributive state in Sweden, and it was also financed by very, very progressive taxes, that would probably start running into the incentives of the people who you actually want to invest in Sweden also. So I think the way that I would like to think about it is that you want to think of taxation together with how those tax revenues are being spent. So again, in a bundle of institutions, and that's why, again, it's hard to say whether a particular thing, a tax rate of 50% or 30%, is that extractive or inclusive. I think you really need to look at the context.
You can just choose.
Sure, please.
Thank you. Is this on?
Seems that way, yeah.
Okay. My question, I'm not yet. So maybe you've already addressed this, but in your opinion, what role should the international humanitarian NGO community play in helping create an inclusive political environment?
That's the next one. No, I mean, again, I think that's a tricky question. What we do in the last chapter is talk about the quote-unquote pessimistic case on that, meaning what it shouldn't do or how it might have gone, it went wrong in some cases, but we don't sort of come up with a roadmap for these are the things that you can do. And there is a reason for that, because I think that's a much, much more complicated question. So I think, not to belittle kind of institutional analysis, which, is what I've spent most of my time over the last 15 years, but I think understanding what's on the ground in terms of the incentives of the players, political, social, and economic incentives, I think it's a feasible thing, and we sort of know what to do. But there's another sort of level of analysis to say, okay, this is the political equilibrium, so to speak. And on top of it, you take an actor or a set of actors that they have their own objective. And how can they intervene? Well, first of all, you need to have some theory of what is the slack in the political system, because there's no slack whatsoever. If everything is fully determined in the political system on the ground, then from the outside there's going to be very little you can do. So you need to have a system of slack, what's in the slack in the system, and in what way you can sort of play with that slack. And also there are some ethical issues. So for instance, imagine that you're an international organization and you say, okay, I want to just bring investment to a nation. But if you bring that investment and that in turn enriches the elite and the elite becomes stronger, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or you bring some sort of political intervention, you say, okay, we're not going to work with the government, we're going to work with opposition groups or with other NGOs, and in return this leads to some clampdown by the government on these NGOs because they're working with you. Like, the Egyptian government jailed people because they were being financed by the United States as civil society organizations after the Tahrir Square. So, so that raises a lot of ethical issues that I think you also have to deal with, and you also have to take into account the objectives of foreign actors. We've talked a little bit about the objectives of the IMF, which I think in general is neither wholly good nor wholly bad, but the same is true for Norwegian NGOs also. They have their own objectives, which often overlap with bringing better civil rights and human rights, sometimes prosperity, but sometimes don't. So I think there's a whole set of issues, so that requires more thought. Yes, please. Sorry, and then after that, sorry. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I was wondering if you could say a few words on what's happening in the Middle East from a point of view of institutional analysis, but in particular the countries that have much weaker institutions than before, like Yemen, for example. People always talk about Egypt, Tunisia, but maybe the Yemen and the least developed member countries. And by the way, how did you come up with this wonderful title?
I don't know. I think Middle East is very, very interesting. I think Middle East is extremely interesting for several reasons. I think the first is, at least, I think it's a great example of a case that was at the heart of all this kind of cultural explanations, which really, over the last 3 years, proved not to be what it seemed. The cultural explanations emphasize, the Middle East. There is a certain set of Middle Eastern culture which not only condemns them to poverty, but also means that they don't want to govern themselves. They can't govern themselves. There is a specific form of respect for authority that makes democracy impossible in the Middle East. And we've seen that's not true. And we've seen that's not true through a sort of set of moves that really perfectly illustrate in some sense the tensions of an extractive society. I think Egypt under Mubarak, Tunisia under Ben Ali, Syria under Assad, Libya under Gaddafi. I think those are all examples of very clear extractive institutions. In Egypt, political power was hugely monopolized in the hands of the NDP and the army and a small group of businessmen. The economic rules of the game were rigged such that there were monopolies created for the politically connected. There wasn't the sort of educational investments that would create a level playing field. And when you look at my reading of the evidence is that when you look at people's discontent with the regime, it was very much related to that extractive institution. I think, people were actually sort of quite sophisticated in their analysis. They were really discontented with their economic lot, but then they linked that to the political system. So when people rose up in Tahrir Square, they didn't say, we want bread or we want better wages. But they said, we want to change this political system because it's only through political change that things will get better. So I think in those senses, it fits very well. I would also say that it sort of fits very well in terms of the difficulties that all of the Middle Eastern countries are experiencing right now, most notably Egypt and Tunisia, and will continue to experience. That, one of the things that I didn't talk about at all, but it's really, one of the topics that gets most attention in the book is the process of institutional persistence. How is it that institutions today pave the way for the sort of changes that can be feasible tomorrow, or how one group will be able to dominate, or how moves towards more inclusive institutions will or will not be hijacked by other groups that want to mold the institutions to their benefit. And we've seen them, very clearly in Latin America. We've seen them in Europe. In Europe, for instance, if you look at the French Revolution, another clear example of a movement that was fueled against a regime that people viewed as absolutist, extractive, repressive. It took about 70 years for France to reach stable institutions that were even minimally politically inclusive after the French Revolution. So there was a very long period of political instability. The same thing in Latin America. So it would be naive to expect that Egypt or Tunisia, let alone Syria or Libya, are going, or Yemen, about which I know even less. So I'm not commenting about Yemen, if you notice. Will be able to turn themselves into stable democracies, politically inclusive institutions overnight. So in that sense, I think, and those sets of tensions are exactly the ones that we have seen in other cases. What are the set of tensions in Egypt, for example? Well, in Egypt, you have two sets of tensions that are pulling in different directions. One is that one part of the ruling coalition under Mubarak, the military, tried to run the country under a different guise. Now Mubarak is gone, but will still run the country. And we don't know the end of that, but it was partly successful, largely unsuccessful. And then there is a danger that another group of people now have taken control and will try to create a different set of extractive institutions, now with themselves at the helm, the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think those are the tensions which you see always whenever you have any sort of movement, radical or gradual, towards change, that you always have to watch out for a new set of extractive institutions, either in form different, but in essence the same, or even in form the same, but dominated by another set of people coming to replace what they were fighting against. Yes, please. Sorry. Just yes.
Thank you for the concept of extractive institutions. I think it's very helpful. And I admire your work in that book and previous work when I knew of you.
Thank you.
Let me make a comment that relates obliquely to your issue about the internet and hope for that. There are two institutions which are extractive for this country that have an enormous impact. One is the media and one are the courts. And the point is that, the power elite, it's clear, really does control access to the media. New York Times and the New York Post are not the opinion centers. We've made things so in Cambridge and in Washington, but that's not where opinions are really created. And there's an enormous grip on those institutions, and it's done deliberately. The second is the courts with Citizen United, where really the courts and the unbalanced stacking of the judiciary, both of the trends in the concentration of the media and the courts do not bode well for even an internet-inspired society. There's this new group of economists called the New Economists who say, well, there's going to be a groundswell revolution, people are going to get fed up, Occupy Wall Street will turn into a 7-day affair, I'm not so optimistic. And by the way, finally, you know, this morning in the NPR broadcast it mentioned that Turkey is a nation that has jailed more journalists, right, than any other country calling themselves a democracy. And of course, the courts are already stacked in that country. How optimistic can we be about regaining, should we say, less extractive characteristics of these institutions in this country?
I think that's a great question. I think on the media, what isn't, to the extent that I know the data, what isn't atypical is that there are rich individuals involved with the media. That's always been the case in the United States. That's been often the case in the past. But they haven't always been sort of allied with the regimes. There's no need for presuming that every, Ted Turner could be a Democrat and Murdoch could be a Republican, and they could sort of go against each other. And then if you don't like either of them, there are other options. I think that's sort of not a bad caricaturization of how the media was, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th century or at the end of the 19th century. The Hearst Empire and other big families dominated a lot of it. But you're right that, at least to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of anything that sort of approaches the Fox News. So there's a study by two economists, Stefano Della Vigna and Ethan Kaplan, and what they did is they exploited the fact that for the 2000 election, Fox News was broadcast in some counties and not others because of the way that the broadband cable was spreading around the country at the time. And in places where the Fox News was broadcast relative to their benchmark in the previous presidential election, Bush got something like 2 percentage point more votes, which is huge. So clearly, some media is having an oversized effect on voting. It might have oversized effect on other aspects, for example, the rise of the Tea Party or the transformation of the Tea Party into what it is today. But I think at the end also recent research by economists Matt Genskow and Jesse Shapiro shows that over the last 20 years, there has been no decline in the variety of channels through which people get their news. In fact, it may have actually increased. So if you look at the data, there isn't really a very large fraction of the people who just listen to Fox News. And part of it is because of the internet, and despite the sort of the concerns that we have about the internet, about the echo chambers and everything, people seem to be getting a variety of different mediums, accessing a variety of different mediums to get their, at least to get what they're calling news and in these surveys. So I think I would say glass is half full or half empty. I think certainly money matters much more because technology now enables one successful operating system to access much more. So that's why something like Fox News is very important. On the other hand, a variety of things like the internet also make it much easier for people to enter at the margin. So if you look at the French Revolution or the English Glorious Revolution, pamphlets were extremely important, and it was very difficult for pamphlets to spread. And they weren't the sort of the sanctioned mechanism. The courts didn't support them, but the pamphleteers were extremely active in criticizing the government and making fun of the king, doing things that were totally unacceptable by the standards of the time, and that probably did play a role in sort of molding the thing. Courts, I think that's a general problem. I think there is no reason to expect that courts are going to be total unbiased arbiters or a bulwark in favor of inclusive institutions. And we've seen many cases in which courts of one form or another have pushed in different directions. And I think that's the concern, and that was also implicit in what I said, the war on terror. I think the courts are much less willing to err on the side of free speech and in the context of the war on terror. But again, I think the fact that Citizens United gets criticized so much, and I think Citizens United is just really the top tip of the iceberg. If Citizens United wasn't there, money would be still as much in politics as it was, So I think that is the problem. Turkey, I think, is a bigger problem, because not only because so many journalists are jailed, but I would say that the bigger problem in Turkey is that the journalists who are not jailed have totally self-censored themselves. And I think that is the real problem. And that's the sense in which I'm saying things like the internet really help, because self-censoring is perhaps a little less. Yes, please?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Actually, I'm a junior undergraduate student from Beijing, China, and I have read your papers such as political institutions as fundamental values of Latin girls. I'm so excited to see you in person instead of and it seems to me that many conclusions or analyses are derived from empirical practice, but actually China and Singapore, they have adopted very different institutions from Western American countries, but they have made notable achievements and somewhat remain the stable state, both politically and economically. So do you believe that there may be some different institutions suitable for different countries? And do you think that China's development is sustainable, accompanied with the government-led reforms in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I mean, I think that's a very important question, and it's one of the things that, unfortunately, we spend quite a bit of time in the book, but unfortunately, in a short talk, it's one of the things that I often sort of don't get time to talk about, but it's good that it's sort of raised in in the questions. So let me sort of give a sort of an answer that sort of goes back a little bit and tries to clarify a few things in the process. I think the first one is that I was sort of a couple of times emphasizing that inclusive institutions are important for sustained economic growth. And in the process, I also mentioned Barbados, for example, a clear extractive society based on slavery was one of the richest places in the world. So how come extractive Barbados could become one of the richest places in the world? Well, it can, because I think extractive institutions aren't inconsistent with economic growth. They aren't inconsistent with prosperity in the short run. And in fact, there's a very good, very, very natural reason for it. Imagine you're a dictator or you're a ruling junta that controls everything. Would you like your country to be poor or rich? I think most dictators would say rich. The problem with extractive institutions is that they can't maintain that prosperity, and they can't maintain that prosperity because they are generally not open to innovation. They are afraid of creative destruction. They're afraid of innovation, new technologies, just like the Francis I and Nikolai I that I explained in the context of the 19th century, Austria-Hungary and Russia. And often they don't allocate resources, and they don't allow individuals to enter into the occupations according to comparative advantage. They want to limit the occupations to themselves or to their friends or to politically allocate them. So I think in this light, then what we have to ask is, what are the conditions under which you can have, let's call it, extractive growth, meaning growth under extractive institutions? And I think I'll give you two examples which I think are quite typical of extractive growth. One is Barbados. So it became rich on the basis of sugar, a valuable resource that could be exploited quite successfully by the planter elite. Sure, they could have done it more efficiently. Having such high mortality wasn't good either for the slaves or for them, but still their method was enough for them to become very, very wealthy and for Barbados to become one of the richest places in the world. The other one is Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia, today we think of it as an economic basket case, but actually people in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, were amazingly excited about Russia, perhaps as much as some people are excited about China today, because Russia was growing so much and so fast on the basis of a different economic system. Many economists, including some of the leading ones, were showing Russia or Soviet Union as an alternative system. Of course, it was nothing of the sort, and it didn't generate any proper innovation, and it was very inefficient, and it sort of crashed and burned. But in the process, it did generate very rapid economic growth. Why? Because it was a case of state-mediated reallocation of resources from very inefficient uses to somewhat less inefficient uses, from agriculture, which was extremely inefficient in Russia and overpopulated, into industry, where there was very little industry in Russia. And it was made feasible by imported technology. So Russia, except for a few places which were related to the armament industry, did not innovate. It just used existing technologies. So, so I think in that light, there is nothing exceptional in the case of a country that grows rapidly for even an extended period of time under extractive institutions. And in fact, the way that I would interpret China's rapid economic growth is a combination of a fundamental reform away from very extractive economic institutions in which price incentives played no role whatsoever under full collective ownership, to a mixed system where prices started playing at the margin an allocative role, increasing production hugely in the late 1970s and then much more in the 1980s. Then the price incentives essentially became fully dominant in the agricultural sector, then in the urban or the industrial sector. So part of the Chinese case is really this rapid growth because of changes in economic institutions. And another aspect is a bit like Russia, which is that it's happening under extractive political institutions, but there was so much inefficiency, both because a lot of resources were trapped in agriculture very unproductively, a lot of them were trapped in the state-owned enterprises that were very inefficient, and now they're being reallocated, and that's generating a lot of growth. But I think, again, if the sort of the ideas that we have sort of developed in the book have some validity, China is going to run into problems with the given system, because the given system is a mixture of somewhat extractive, somewhat inclusive economic institutions, increasingly more inclusive, but still highly extractive because of the dominant role of the party and the command economy in industry, together with an extractive political system. And this combination of extractive political system and somewhat inclusive economic system are not always cohesive. And as low-hanging fruit of importing technology from abroad, which China still has quite a bit of room for doing so, since it's still less than 1/6 of the income per capita of the United States and about 1/6 of the income per capita of Germany. I think those at some point will start running out. And at that point, I think either there has to be a more fundamental political change, the sort of thing that, for example, we witnessed in Taiwan or South Korea, which also started economic growth under extractive political institutions, under sort of an economic opening, and then finally, when there was enough demand from bottom up, the military juntas sort of gave in. Or there will be sort of a clampdown, just like in the Soviet Union, not being able to keep up with the next stage of economic development. And the way that I would say answer finally the sort of the thing that you've hinted at, again, this is just my perspective and the perspective that James and I have developed in the book. I would say that country's context is very important, but not very important for what is the right economic policy. I think economically there is nothing hugely different across countries. In every country, you have entrepreneurial skills, entrepreneurial talent, you have a distribution of skills, you want people to be able to have the incentives and the security to make investments, and you want some sort of system, mostly based on markets, because that's the only one that works, to allocate people according to their comparative advantage, according to their talent. Where countries are different is in terms of their history and their political constraints. So it makes sense for different countries to follow different paths. That's because of the political reality. But I wouldn't say, personally, that we need a different economics for China and a different economics for Taiwan and a different one for Germany. I think it's the same economics, but the political realities lead to different modulations. Thank you. Yes, please?
So I have a question about this inclusive extractive use. I mean, no political system is going to tell you that they're building an extractive institution, right? I mean, you look at America, like one for one, Democrats say that, they want to make everything, they want to have more regulation so they can sort of support the lower 99% or. And the Republicans say that, well, you have to support small business, right? So, but on the other hand, each of them feeds off distrust of different parts of society to try to build up their own political basis. And as much as we say globalization sort of increases equality or whatever, it also creates much more distrust among different parts of
Much more, sorry?
distrust among different parts of society, and you see sort of sociological basis for that in terms of Putnam studies, which talk about as diversity increases, you have much more distrust among different parts of society. You see that in the US, you see that in even Western Europe, where even socialist states, now there's much more political consensus on the right for much more exclusive parties or much more things like that. So how do you see that evolving over time? As you know, because again, nobody's going to come and tell you that they're building an expected institution. Everybody talks about inclusion as their story. So how do you sort of see that evolving as globalization increases?
I think those are very good questions. I don't have perfect answers to them, but I mean, you're absolutely right. Nobody sort of claims that they're setting up a system that's going to benefit themselves at the expense of the rest. So even Francis I or Nikolai I or the Ottoman emperors or the Chinese emperors, they said, we want stability for our own people, which was a code word. We want stability for ourselves. But I think, you know, you're touching upon one thing that perhaps is different today than in the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, the Gilded Age, where I was drawing some parallels, perhaps, you know, how the United States today might be able to sort of overcome the sort of challenges. So I think, you know, because the government played so much of a more limited role in the 19th century, and you know, it was so much easier to have a sort of a set of ideas that sort of organized people and that said, look, you know, there are people who are getting a special deal because of their political power and because of their economic power. They have the senators in their pockets. You know, the Senate wasn't elected, and in fact, many of the senators were on the payroll of the robber barons, and these robber barons are getting these really hugely lucrative deals. And it was sort of a simple sort of set of ideas that people could identify with. Today, you know, we have a huge federal government that has its own agenda. It has a huge set of inefficiencies. So then you have these sort of more mixed sort of thing, which says, you know, oh, you know, federal government is part of the problem. No, federal government is part of the solution, and that's much more divisive because it's neither part of the solution. Well, it's both part of the solution and part of the problem. So that might be a much more sort of a subtle message and might make it much harder for people to sort of organize around the right sort of ideas. I don't know. It's just a possibility. Yes, please.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the United States there's a danger. There's more concentration of power on the elite, and how it is politically unstable to have inequality. But I mean, I would like you to maybe emphasize that actually there is a connection between the economic and the political aspect, because if you have inequality, the new men, which you mentioned the oligarchs didn't like, the new men will not be able to become innovators if they're wasting wasting time and just trying to survive, and they won't have the education.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. That's why, I mean, absolutely. That's what I was hinting at, but I wasn't explicit enough. That's why I was mentioning the education system in this context. And then the other problem is really, to what extent does a society manage economic inequality together with a level playing field? And I think there isn't a economic law that says you cannot have a level playing field with economic inequality, but there might be very severe political constraints. So ominously, and in line with what you're saying, the United States has experienced, according to the data that a number of researchers have put together, a quite significant decline in social mobility at the same time as inequality increased. So that suggests that indeed, as you are saying, you know, if we take social mobility as the sign that people who start with, you know, poor parents and modest backgrounds rise up to become the leading entrepreneurs, that's actually going down, and that is sort of a concern, right? Yes, please. Yes, I think that's what the organizers want.
Oh, it's not working?
Just shout.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting.
Thank you.
I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about. I was very much interested in then what makes the society or the leaders choose these inclusive institutions, because there has to be some kind of a factor X, as it were, or certain kind of conditions that allow them to choose these inclusive institutions that does allow for sustenance of economic growth. And on the same level, you mentioned some of the failures that leading to choosing the inclusive in the Virginia case, but it doesn't seem to be the only the Russian and the Austria-Hungary, you sort of alluded to the leader's choice over some kind of a social disparity. And the Russian case, probably maybe the geopolitical security situation had changed with the Germany's Schlieffen plan that made the Russian leave completely. I'm wanting to know what are the things that actually choose. And then also you mentioned that I thought of the institutions when I'm hearing that some kind of a set kind of a system, as it were, that was less malleable, less changeable afterwards. But your mention about the United States doesn't seem to take it as a sort of solid form. Then is it the same kind of conditions that allow for the non-choosing of the inclusive? Because it should explain the rise and the fall. So why nations succeed once but then fail again? So what is happening here?
So many questions. I think all of them very good ones. But so let me answer a subset of them, or let me try to answer a subset of them. So I think you're absolutely right. There are many ways in which inclusive or extractive institutions emerge, and I have just illustrated with that historical example one specific way, which is particularly simple because it's sort of largely imposed or tried to be imposed from above. But in many cases, of course, the reason why England ended up with the Glorious Revolution and then democratization in the 19th century and Russia didn't, that's not so much of an external one. It's sort of internal dynamics. So I think we have to understand all of them. And I think the way that we sort of, the framework that we sort of try to trace out in the book is that we sort of have two elements to it. One is internal dynamics. So the way that different conflicts and tensions within a country gets resolved is going to vary. Some of it is going to vary for random reasons. Some of it is going to vary for historical, roots. Some of it is going to vary because of different sort of leadership, and I'll come back to the issue of leadership in a second. And that sort of creates an institutional drift. If you start with two similar nations, that institutional drift will lead them in different directions. But then even bigger changes come when this institutional drift meets critical junctures, meaning that now you shock the system with big things, World War II, or the Black Death, which is a huge demographic shock, or the rise of Atlantic trade and overseas trade for Europe at the end of the 15th century. So those interact with these existing conditions on the ground and lead to even more of a divergence, and we try to sort of go through some big events in history through that sort of prism. And as this sort of discussion perhaps hints at, this is not a fully deterministic thing. So that's the sense in which, yes, institutions are a set and a system, and their different parts are reinforcing each other. And that's the feedback that, for example, I was mentioning, when that's also at the root of the persistence. But they're not unchangeable. They're not so much malleable from the outside that if I come from the outside and I want to change one piece, I can do so, but they are subject to sort of opposition and demand for change constantly, as for instance, which rises and which ebbs and flows, as we've done in the context of the Middle East. And in those contexts, some random factors will play a role, and leadership will play a role. But I think what we emphasize in the book is that yes, leadership is important, but you can't explain things by just the intentions of the leaders, nor can you trust the success of a nation on the leadership. Leadership matters in a number of different ways. So for instance, take the civil rights movement that I mentioned. Well, leadership really mattered there. If you didn't have a leader as unifying as Martin Luther King and a movement like the NAACP that created sort of a relatively broad coalition and made it easy for the federal government and the northern sort of wing of the Democratic Party to fall in line, the civil rights movement would not have been as successful, or would not have been successful when it was. Or we talk about, for instance, in the book about Botswana, where leadership of a different sort, where somebody with the authority to sort of lead to tribal institutions turned out to be very different, very constrained in some sense, but also very different in his interests than almost all of the other post-independence African leaders, Seretse Khama, and that probably did play a role. But I think for our theory, if you want to think of it, we don't have a leadership theory, a theory of leadership. We don't have an explanation for why Seretse Khama didn't try to undermine everything and Mobutu or Mugabe did. So they're sort of the residual that sort of act like a shock.
I think one more question.
Yes, please, yes.
Actually, this is very related to the former question. I can see that you're not prescribing, you're analyzing.
Right, exactly.
And that's probably when the political leadership issue comes into the picture. I keep comparing your work to Barrington Moore's, and provided the title of your former book also indicates that. And if I really, think in terms of this quote, like Marx, men make history, but not under conditions, I don't know the exact quote.
Of their choosing, right,
yeah.
yes.
I think compared to Barrington Moore, your work is heavier on the men make history part of that sentence. Right. Whereas Barrington Moore's would be on the other side, condition. So that's why I was also a bit puzzled, when you were referring to leadership as, it's not because of leadership that, institutions are not inclusive or, there must be some room for that. I see more political will in your work because your analysis is based on institutions and they are man-made after all.
Right. No, absolutely, you're right. In the sense that I think it opens the way for that, but we don't have a theory for it. So in other words, yes, Barrington Moore is a great inspiration to us, especially for the previous book, but for this one. And of course, both Marx and Marxist historians and Barrington Moore have touched upon some of these issues. I think the way that we are different from both of them in some aspects is, and I would mention two of them in particular. And also we certainly don't subscribe to any of the Marxist economics, but I think in this context of your question, one is that I think both Marx and Barrington Moore, to a lesser degree, really emphasize the sort of the defining role of economics. And Marx, the feudal relations give you this, and steam mill gives you this, and for us, in some sense, economics matters, but it's really political institutions and the distribution of political power that shapes it. And we have, within the context, within the constraints that our work imposes on us, we have some theory of these institutions. But as soon as you open the way for institutions, political institutions and political power, that also opens the way for other forms of agency or other forms of individual behavior. But that's the sense in which I answered the previous question about policy as well. That really requires a much more in-depth analysis of what are the slacks in the system and what is it that leaders can do and what are they that they cannot do. So probably, I don't know, Seretse Khama, if it wasn't Seretse Khama, but it was Mugabe in Botswana, that would have made a big difference. But Seretse Khama would not have been able to make so much of a difference in Ghana, let's say. So those are the things that I think that need to be analyzed. And I think the key is not economic conditions, or what Marx would call economic substructure, but really the distribution of political power, what coalitions have formed, what de facto and de jure the political power and constraints there are. But this is what we have right now.
The book is for sale out here. I really urge you to get one for your Republican friends. For everybody, really. It's a great book. Thank you, Darren. Thank you for doing